Hello everyone, this is a guide on overclocking RAM on a Ryzen system using a Gigabyte motherboard. Today we will be overclocking Hynix A-die memory modules. I will try to release a guide for overclocking Hynix M-die and Samsung RAM in the near future. So subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for the video release. When turning on the PC, press the delete key to enter the BIOS. Press F2 to switch to advanced mode. First and foremost, we need to set the UCLK div1 mode. Select UCLK equals memclk. Now, go to the System Memory Multiplier option and choose the frequency. Since we are using Hynix A-die memory chips, the operating frequency will range from 6000 to 6400 MHz, depending on the motherboard. We won't set it to 6400 MHz as it requires high voltage and can be dangerous. I will show you two overclocking options. The first one will work for 95% of users without any issues. And the second profile is for advanced overclockers and requires active cooling for the RAM. As you can see, we have a fan for airflow. So let's get started. We choose a multiplier of 60, then scroll down to find core SoC, the voltage for the memory controller. As stated by AMD, the maximum allowable SoC voltage for memory overclocking is 1.35 volts, but it won't be necessary for 6000 MHz. Set it to approximately 1.2 volts, and I recommend a range of 1.15 to 1.25. If it's not stable, you can increase it to 1.25 volts. I believe no one will need to raise the voltage to 1.3 volts for Hynix A-die at a frequency of 6000 MHz. Next, we adjust the voltage of the RAM, DDR5, which is divided into two parts, DDR-VDD and DDR-VDDQ. For a frequency of 6000 MHz with a delay of CL30, CL32, 1.35 volts for DDR-VDD is sufficient. The voltage of DDR-VDDQ is set 0.05 volts lower than DDR-VDD, so we set it to 1.3 volts. You will also need the voltage of CPU VDDIOMEM for the memory controller. For such frequencies, in 95% of cases, 1.25 volts is more than enough. We go to the advanced memory settings, and the first thing we encounter is gear down mode. Honestly, I don't see the point of enabling it. The difference between having gear down mode enabled and disabled is within the margin of error. Additionally, some timings may need to be increased, and possibly even the voltage, therefore, we leave it on auto. I also see no point in enabling power down enable. This setting will give us lower latency, but we'll have to sacrifice fast Windows startup, so let's leave it on auto as well. Next, let's go to memory sub-timing. So, for primary timings, I suggest setting the primary values and only two secondary parameters. First, set the CAS latency, TCL to 30, TRCD to 36 or 38 depending on the module's quality. In most cases, 36 will work. TRP should also be set to 36. For TRAS, leave it on auto for now, we'll come back to it later. Next, set TWR to 48 on Ryzen. This is the minimum value. Even if you set it to 44, the motherboard will automatically set it to 48. Consequently, we can also set TRTP. For Hynix A-die, it's recommended to set TRTP to 12. This doesn't apply to Samsung and other modules. For more details, please wait for a separate guide where I'll explain further. Next, why did we skip TRAS? Because we need to set TRTP first. TRAS is calculated using the formula TRCD plus TRTP. Our TRCD is 36, and TRTP is 12. Adding 36 plus 12 gives us 48. Then, press F10, enter, and proceed to Windows. Next, we'll need a software pack. You can download it from the description of this video. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and click the bell icon. After downloading the software pack, unpack it on your desktop. Open the folder, and we'll start with AIDA64. We need to make sure there are no drops in performance. Launch AIDA64, click on Services, then Cache and Memory Benchmark. Click Start. Excellent, the tests are completed, and we can see that we have 6000 MHz, which we have set. This means we haven't made any mistakes. The timings are 30, 36, 36, 48 with CR1. You don't need to pay attention to the North Bridge clock value. Currently, AIDA64 doesn't read it correctly on any version. Our performance indicators are read 58, write 83, copy 60, and latency 66.8. Okay, next, I recommend running ZenTimings. As we can see, the FCLK is set to 2000 MHz by default. Observant viewers might have noticed that we didn't change it. Don't worry, we'll do that shortly. Please note that the Gigabyte motherboard sets very high timings by default, but we'll fix that now. So, let's proceed to memory testing. Go to the AMD tab and select MemTestPro. If you have the option to purchase Karhu RAM test, it's better to use Karhu. Personally, I trust Karhu more. To correctly run Karhu, go to Advanced and enable CPU cache mode, and activate Stress FPU by checking the box. Next, if you have 32 GB with a single rank, set it to 28 GB, and set the number of threads based on your processor. For example, I have an 7600X with 12 threads, so I press start. I understand that most of you won't be able to purchase Karhu RAM test as it's difficult to find for free, or some might not want to pay for it. Therefore, there is a very good free alternative available in the AMD tab called MemTestPro. Run it, enter the number of threads, and click Start. It's advisable to open HW info in the background to monitor temperatures, but there's a small caveat here too. DDR5 doesn't have temperature sensors on the memory chips, but there are SPD sensors which can be used for reference. Our voltage is set to 1.35 volts, which is perfectly safe. Often, DDR5 XMP sets higher voltages, but my RAM has good heatsinks. Look at the SPD sensor, and if we see temperatures above 55 degrees Celsius, it's a cause for concern. Ideally, if we see 55 degrees, we should lower the voltage and, consequently, sacrifice either the CL or the frequency. Therefore, in the background, you should periodically monitor the SPD sensor. How long to run this test when checking primary timings? So on the first stage, 10 to 15 minutes will suffice. If within 10 to 15 minutes we don't experience overheating, blue screens, black screens, crashes, and there are no errors like this one here, you see, error 0, it means that everything is fine for now. If everything is fine, then we restart and go back to Windows. Next, open the folder again, but this time go to the Intel folder because we forgot to duplicate the test folder in AMD. Find Y-Cruncher, right-click on it, select Show Additional Options, and then click on Create Shortcut. You can then move the shortcut to your desktop. Right-click on the shortcut, select Show Additional Properties, and in the target field at the end of the text, add a space and write Stress VST like I have it. Next, click on Apply, then OK, and launch Y-Cruncher. It's recommended to run this test for 5 to 10 cycles. It's an excellent test to check if you have set the memory controller voltage sufficiently for this frequency. It will also help you determine the stability of the frequency. If you have set too high of a frequency for your motherboard or memory controller, you will encounter errors. This means you may experience a blue screen or see red errors during the test. You can correct them in two ways. The first is to increase the SoC voltage and VDDQ voltage. The second way is to lower the memory frequency or the FCLK frequency, as FCLK can also cause errors in Y-Cruncher. Alright, let's run 5 to 10 cycles and restart. Enter the BIOS and continue. If there are errors, restart again, enter the BIOS, and lower one of the previously mentioned parameters. Great, first let's set a reasonable TRC. How do we do that? It's simple, TROS plus TRP, which means 3648 equals 84. Next find the timing TRFC1. For Hynix A-die at a frequency of 6000 or even 6200, it will usually be around 400. Lowering it too much can result in decreased FPS in games or additional freezes. However, it's also not recommended to set it too high because it's one of the few timings that genuinely affect performance in games. Let's set it to around 400. TRFC2 and TRFCSB should be left on auto as they have been since the time of Zen and Zen Plus. These parameters are ignored. Moving on, set TRRDL and TRRDS to 8 and 8 respectively, and set TFAW to 32. These are conditionally the minimum values. Going lower may not provide much improvement, but it can lead to freezes. Therefore, confidently set the values like mine for Hynix A-die. Press F10, enter, and run the tests again to check TRFC. Next, I suggest running the AMD cache and memory test to ensure that everything is going well without any drops. We should only see improvements at this stage. As we can see, there has been an overall increase of about 5%. If the performance remains the same or worsens, it means something was done incorrectly. It's advisable to go through the guide again and start over. At this point, there is little need to test Y Cruncher because we have already determined that the frequency is working fine with these voltages. I suggest running the MemTestPro to ensure that the timings we have set do not cause any errors. If you encounter errors during this test, you can try setting TRCD to 38. There is a possibility that the errors are caused by TRCD. However, ideally, such errors should have appeared during the previous run of MemTestPro or Karhu, and you should have adjusted the other timings accordingly, such as TRAS and TRC. I believe you understand the concept. Furthermore, there is a very small chance that TRFC of 400 might not work properly at this frequency. This usually happens with extremely unlucky modules, although I can't recall any such cases. There is also a possibility of crashes due to overheating, so monitor the temperature, at least through the SPD, and if possible, use active cooling. Test for approximately 15 minutes, then restart and enter the BIOS again. As we can see, I made a small mistake here. I wrote 20 threads, but the Ryzen 7600X only has 12 threads. Therefore, write the correct number of threads for your processor. This can affect the testing. Next, we continue tuning the secondary timings. We set TWTRL and TWTRS to 16 and 4. You can try lower values like 12 and 2, but there won't be any significant improvement. Next, set TRDRDSCL and TWRWRSCL. On Zen and Zen 2, they had some impact on performance. However, here they don't have much influence. But pay attention, Gigabyte sets the last SCL to 23, which, in my opinion, is too high. Therefore, set both to 8. In fact, they can even work at 4 and 2. There won't be any performance gain, but it might affect stability. So, set them to 8 and 8, and everything will be fine. But please note that everything I'm mentioning about timings specifically applies to Hynix A-die chips. There will be a separate guide for Hynix M-die. So, these ranges are specifically for A-die. Next, TRDRDSC, TRDRDSD, TRDRDDD. If you have two 16GB memory modules, there's a 99% chance that they are single-rank modules. You can either leave them unconfigured or, for aesthetic purposes, set them to 111. Set TRDRDSC to 1 for almost all modules, regardless of whether you have, for modules, 232GB modules, etc., it's always set to 1. TRDRDSD is responsible for ranks. So, if you have 232GB modules, setting it to 1 won't work. Leave it on auto or wait for the next guide. TRDRDDD is better left on auto as well. I don't think there will be any improvement by adjusting it. If you have two modules with one slot free on each channel, then set it to 1. TWRWRSC is also always set to 1. These two timings, TWRWRSD and TWRWRDD, are similar to the previous ones. TWRWRSD is for ranks, and TWRWRDD is for the number of modules. Since I have two 16GB modules, I set them to 1. You can leave them on auto. Next, press F10, enter, and run the test for another 15 minutes. Whether it's MemTestPro or Karhu, the cache and memory test didn't show much response to lowering the secondary and tertiary timings. In principle, as you may have understood, it's probably fine to leave them on auto. However, it's best to test them in games to see if there is a specific improvement from these timing adjustments. Also, check the MemTestPro. Here, it's desirable to run the test for 15 to 20 minutes. Don't forget to pay attention to the temperature. As we can see, we can still adjust the values. We have TWRRD and TRDWR, as well as TRE5 accordingly. If everything is stable for 15 to 20 minutes, restart and enter the BIOS. If there are errors, enter the BIOS and change the previous values. For TWRRD with two 16GB modules, which means 32GB single rank, always set it to 1. If you have two 32GB modules, two 64GB modules, or 4 modules with 16GB or 32GB, the range will be from 4 to 8. The next timing, TRDWR, for Hynix A-die, it's 95% likely to work at 18 on a frequency of 6000. A frequency of 6200 rarely requires 20. Usually, it also works at 18. On a frequency of 6000, you can go lower than 18, but test for stability and check if there is any benefit from it. Spoiler alert, there is hardly any benefit from going lower. So, set it to 18, so, after that, it's advisable to press F10 and save the BIOS. You can save it in the Save Exit tab. Press it and write something memorable, like timing adjustments. Then press enter once again, enter, and return to the timings. Next, we only have TREF left. There are two options for configuring it. The first option is to press enter, press the up arrow, and set it to the maximum value. It's recommended to then test it with MemTestPro or Karhu because there's a small chance that it may not work at the maximum value. If it doesn't work at the maximum, and there are issues like instability or even lower FPS, then set it to 32,640 and test it again. There's a third option, which is my suggestion, to set it to 65,024. So, the memory overclocking is essentially done, but we can still fine-tune the Infinity Fabric. By default, at a frequency of 6000, it sets the FCLK to 2000. But there's a chance that it will work higher, for example, 2033, 2067, 2100, all the way up to 2200. But there's one catch: it's preferable to test it in games and measure the FPS using benchmarks, because there's a chance that at 2100, it may be stable, but the FPS could be lower. Unfortunately, this can only be determined through empirical testing and FPS measurements. It's best to run some benchmarks at minimum settings to see any differences. Let's set it to 2100 MHz and see how IDA64 reacts to it, but a bit later. Additionally, you can also adjust the voltages to their minimums. For example, set the SoC voltage to 1.2 volts. It's possible that it may not be needed and 1.15 volts will be sufficient, as you already know. You should test the voltages using Y-Cruncher. Set it to 1.15 volts, test it with Y-Cruncher, and for DIMM, you can try setting it to 1.25, for example, and test it with Y-Cruncher. This can help reduce the heat generated by the memory. You can see 6000 CL30 FCLK 2000, which means that by default, the read performance is noticeably lower. As we can see, it has had a good impact on read and copy speeds, while the latency doesn't differ significantly, with 59.6 compared to 59.9. We also notice a slight dip in L3 cache performance. This could be due to testing variations, and it's possible that in games, we may actually experience lower FPS or some freezes. Therefore, it's essential to conduct additional testing in games and ensure that everything is functioning well. Setting the Infinity Fabric frequency higher hasn't resulted in lower FPS. Additionally, running IDA64 for cache and memory is not a definitive solution. It is influenced by various factors, particularly background processes. For example, if you have live wallpapers on your desktop, running a browser, or other tasks like Discord, the values can vary significantly, usually in a negative direction. Alright, it's advisable to also check Y-Cruncher VST. We already created a profile at the beginning, so simply launch it, perform the test, and I'll repeat, don't forget to test in games. Essentially, the overclocking of 6000 CL30 is complete. Test everything as much as possible. Use the MemTestPro by running it for 6 hours, 8 hours, and then play demanding games, preferably ones like Call of Duty Warzone, and ensure that you don't experience blue screens or performance drops. Alright, it's advisable to also check Y-Cruncher VST. We already created a profile at the beginning, so simply launch it, perform the test, and I'll repeat, don't forget to test in games. Essentially, the overclocking of 6000 CL30 is complete. Test everything as much as possible. Use the MemTestPro by running it for 6 hours, 8 hours, and then play demanding games, preferably ones like Call of Duty Warzone, and ensure that you don't experience blue screens or performance drops. Now let's move on to a small bonus for those who have watched until this point. I know there are very few people who have done so. Not everyone can watch these guides from start to finish without skipping. Now let's create a profile for 6200 CL28. I'll say right away that there won't be a significant boost from this, but for those who value every FPS, get comfortable and proceed to the BIOS. To create a profile for 6200 CL28, we need to understand a few things. Firstly, not every processor, and in general, not every motherboard can achieve a frequency of 6200 MHz. It's possible that either the processor or the motherboard won't allow it, but we'll set it to 6200 MHz because my system allows it. Next, the Infinity Fabric. Choose it based on the same principles I mentioned earlier. And finally, when you're absolutely certain that 6200 MHz is stable and CL28 is working for you, then try setting the FCLK to 2067 to 2100, up to 2200 on 6200 MHz. So, raise the FCLK at the very end. Keep that in mind, as I may forget to remind you later. Next is the SoC voltage. The maximum SoC voltage we can set with the latest AGESA is 1.3 volts. If you need to go higher, like 1.35 volts, it won't be possible. The higher the SoC voltage, the higher the frequency we can achieve with our memory. In general, 1.3 volts is sufficient for 6200, depending on the memory controller's capabilities. Next, the VDDIO voltage can be increased up to 1.4 volts, even up to 1.45 volts, that's normal. However, when it comes to DDR VDD voltage, you need to be very careful. Some BIOS versions on Gigabyte and some ASRock motherboards have had this issue as well. There's a possibility that if you set it higher than 1.435 volts, the motherboard may raise it to 2 volts without your knowledge. So, you set it to 1.45 volts, thinking everything is fine, but no, you're the lucky owner of a Gigabyte motherboard. You check in HW Info in Windows and see that your memory is running at 2 volts. They claim to have fixed this issue, but I don't know what BIOS version you have. It's advisable to install the latest version to avoid this. Be as cautious as possible. The first thing you should do when you enter Windows is to check the actual voltage set by your motherboard. For 6200 CL28, you'll need 1.45 volts, or even higher, like 1.47 volts. Such voltages should not be set without active cooling. If you don't have active cooling on your memory, it's not recommended to do this. Set the frequency to 6000 MHz and CL30 instead. Next, the VDDQ voltage follows the same rule as I mentioned earlier. Set it to approximately 1.42 volts, which is 0.05 volts lower. Now let's talk about the timings. Since we want CL28, let's start with TRCD set to 38, and then lower it to 36 if it works correctly. Similarly, set TRP to 38 and TROS to 38 plus 12, which gives us 50. Next, TRC is determined by the formula TROS TRP, so it's 50 plus 38, resulting in 88. I have already tested my memory earlier and know that I will have approximately 36, 48 timings, so I'm setting it back to 84. But for your case, it's better to double check on which frequency it works for you. Moving on, TRFC1 at 400 may not work since the frequency is higher. Therefore, it's preferable to raise it to around 440 and then fine-tune the values accordingly. The same goes for TRAFE, it's better to leave it on auto or set it to half, around 32,640. After verifying that 6200 MHz works for you with CL28, come back here and try increasing TRAFE back to 65,024 and lowering TRFC1. Regarding the other timings, you can leave them as they are since they are already at reasonable values for 6200 MHz. And let's not forget about TRDWR. Well, in case you have very lucky modules that can handle 16 even at 6200 MHz, but honestly, I don't see the point, so let's leave it at 18 as well. Save the profile. As I mentioned before, test it using YCruncher VST and check the timing correctness with Karhu or MemTestPro. Now let's see the performance improvement we have achieved. Go to IDAS64 cache and memory test, run the benchmark, and observe the difference between 6000 MHz CL30 on the left and 6200 MHz CL28 on the right. As we can see, the difference is not impressive, and even the FPS difference won't be significant. But for those who want to squeeze the maximum performance out of their hardware, you can give it a try, and I've shown you how to do it in this video. I tried to make the guide detailed so that there are no unanswered questions, but if you still have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. There are many more guides planned ahead. All the links are in the description. Thank you all for your attention, and goodbye.